No,
Okay.
perfect.
Yeah, you sound clearer now, I'd say.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good.
So so to answer your question, I'm kind of like 10 minutes from like Asbury Park, which I think you're probably familiar with.
Oh yeah, I've been there. I it's freaking magical there. I think I might have had the best bagel I've ever had right
Yes.
there. There was like a corner store. What's the name of that place? It was the best bagel experience a person could possibly ever have. Ever, anywhere.
That doesn't even
I
narrow
mean,
it down. There's so many good bagels here.
I we stayed at the hotel. I don't remember where it was. Um, and it was really early in the morning. And I think typical to the music world, feast and famine, you know, either you're playing on a parking lot, throwing a drum rug over a grease stain
Right.
and happily taking your $100 and buying Trader Joe's, or you might be in a tour bus that's driven all night, which is cool. And a rare exception to the music world, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then in my case, we were in Asbury Park and I was starving, man.
Yeah.
And I just left the hotel. I'm like, where can I get a bagel? And they just directed me to like a really cool mom and pop corner store. And it was just, man, it was just so good. And it was just being in the East Coast it was fun. And that area is kind of magical. I don't know. I didn't come up listening to Springsteen. You have to bring up Springsteen, right? When you bring up Asbury Park, right?
People do. People do. Yeah. I mean, he's actually around quite a bit. Like it's not uncommon to just walk around walk around Asbury. He'll be walking by. He's pretty ever present.
Right. Yeah. And I got into the habit. Do you read like rock memoirs, music memoirs?
Yes, I just read a couple amazing ones. I'm super obsessed with that genre. I read my wife got me to finally read Anthony Kiedis's book, which she's been trying to get me to read for like 15 years, and I finally
Okay.
read that.
And I just read that too. I just
Amazing.
read that too. And I feel like that talks about LA,
Yeah.
a scene that I was sort of am in peripherally, you know.
Mhm.
Those guys were definitely steeped in more Hollywood culture and LA culture. They almost embody it. And I feel like Springsteen, I don't know enough about New Jersey or New Jersey culture past what the typical West Coaster might throw out there.
Right.
But between Steve Van Zant's memoir and Springsteen's, I really felt a connection. It was harder for me to connect maybe to the E Street Band. I mean, I think I read his memoir, and then all along I had listened to that record Nebraska,
Hmm.
and I found that was a real connection to me. Nebraska was a beautiful record, and then maybe going to Asbury Park and
Yeah.
just hanging out, and then I think those guys, Springsteen and Van Zant, are very well read, interesting, self-reflective people who from my perspective have a type of depth that I don't necessarily think is shows in their music as much. Hearing them talk and hearing them reflect kind of made felt gave me a connection to that area a lot more than I would had I just listened to Born in the USA
Mm.
or some of his catalog. I would have thought one thing and then maybe making friends. I mean, it used to be with people from Jersey. It used to be that like coming up, you get so tribal about where you're from, California versus East
Hmm.
Coast versus West Coast. And then the older I get, the more I traveled and going to Asbury was really special. It was like special to me, I think. Seeing a whole different walk of life, going for a run, checking it out, maybe running into an area or two that maybe I shouldn't have been in, meeting Danny Clinch,
Yeah. Of
playing
course.
a little bit of music there. And then I remember I played a gig once at the Stone Pony. It meant a lot to me.
Hmm.
Um, and then, maybe as a fan, watching The Sopranos or reading those memoirs and stuff like that, it pulled me in a lot more to where you're from. and maybe some nuances of the East Coast that made me really appreciate it and respect it, you know?
You know, it's interesting hearing you say that because I haven't read either of those memoirs, but obviously I'm familiar with their music, but I'm not overly familiar with Bruce's music, to be honest with you. But when you talk about my area, it's interesting because it's the kind of place that, you know, I do a lot of traveling, not as much as you, obviously, but I travel quite a bit as well. And you meet people from all over the place, and you see similarities and you see differences between cultures and areas and weather and blah blah blah. But there is something about like this area that just has like a sort of a grind and a hustle built into its DNA. I think people here
Mm-hmm.
have a tendency to really appreciate things and are willing to work for things that some areas I've been to, it doesn't seem to feel the same way. Like we only have good weather half the year. So when it's nice out, we really like love it. And people that are
Yep.
looking for opportunities are really, really willing to work their ass off for it. And there's something about that that's sort of like hard grained in us. And I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of quote unquote successful people or artistic people are from New Jersey, New York, Philly, these areas. There is some sort of
Mm-hmm.
a realness and authenticity to it all, I think, because we are willing to deal with the snow and deal with the traffic and all the other nonsense. And it's very family oriented, I find.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very friend
Mm-hmm.
loyal place and a very family oriented
Mm-hmm.
place, which that
Mm-hmm.
definitely keeps me here. The family aspect. It's definitely not the weather, but there's
Oh, yeah.
the culture and then the connection with people is very authentic that I find pretty unique.
Oh yeah, dude. It was eye-opening to me too to leave the West Coast and to go to school in Boston,
Yeah,
you
what a
know.
change.
New England, yeah, what a change. I mean, dude, and New England is its own animal, you
Uh-huh.
know. I think there's some different nuances to Boston, you know. Feel like, well, okay, I went to Berkeley School of Music, total fish out of water.
Hmm.
Um, I got a little bit of a late start in maybe trying to make a serious go at like understanding music and what makes it tick and trying to come from like a more informed place, you
Okay.
know?
Yeah.
And I would just sort of like blindly reach towards Berkeley. And I think I I can't speak for other artists, but for me, like there are some creative people that I rub elbows with that really have a strong direction of what they want to do or what they don't want to do, you know? And they have a concept. Maybe even their concept is bigger. Their emphasis on what their concept is and what feels right and who they want to be is even maybe bigger than the notes, the notes that they're able to pluck out or the technique or how well they can read or how many different styles they can play.
Mm.
Um, and I really admire that cloth of musician, you know? And I don't think that I that part came naturally to me. And so I think music school was like my way of trying to figure stuff out because I just didn't know, you know. Part of it was, and I think a lot of guys that were my classmates might have gone through the same thing, is that you just sort of make the assumption that, man, if I learn theory and harmony and I can play jazz standards and I take labs and all kinds of great Brazilian and Latin, like Afro-Cuban, Brazilian, whatever. If I get this background, I will get good, quote good, and then when I'm good, I can do all this stuff and display this virtuosity, and then I'll get to do all these things that I've dreamt of, right? And it makes a lot of sense. And I'd seen a lot of other people that had taken that route, were very focused and disciplined, and that route really worked for them, you know? And
Hmm.
so I think that's what I was looking for when I came out to the East Coast was that experience. And in certain ways I was happy and I grew. But it's so funny how it wasn't in the ways that I thought. Um, thing about Boston that was really great is they don't let you hide out, you know? You can't go, at least for me, like with the people that I went to go study with, for lack of a better term, you know, there was no hiding out. If you weren't ready, if you weren't prepared, if you didn't practice, they weren't having it. You couldn't hide out, couldn't, there was no hustle. there, you either did it or you didn't. And the same goes when you'd sit in a jam session or you play. If it was good, they liked it, and if it sucked, they were not nice about it. It's my opinion, and it kind of makes you tough. There's like a tougher thing. Um, if someone was your friend from New England, they were your friend.
Oh
But
yeah.
I'll tell you what, it took you a long time to get to be friends with them. And if they didn't like you, they would tell you right away. If a car did not want you to walk across the street, it would accelerate. It wouldn't decelerate, you know? Um, and it took me a second to get used to the specific nuance of New England. But the good things were when I went there that I got to study or just check out or hang out with. Study's like a stupid word. I got to hang out with some of the best jazz drummers on the planet, including this guy named Alan Dawson. And you're not a drummer, right?
No.
Um, and but Alan Dawson was the drummer who taught the drummers. He
Hmm.
was the guy. And I just remember driving to his house in Lexington, and he was such a good jazz drummer. He had not only played with like Stan Getz and Bill Evans and Sonny Chris, just the who's who of the bebop drummers. Um, but he'd get up behind his drums and he would sit behind a vibraphone and play through any form, any jazz standard with any various form. And his students would accompany him on drums. That level of teaching is rare, at least as far as I've seen. And you'd get all kinds of people with that type of pedigree who chose to steep themselves in like academic rigors rather than maybe go to a bigger city and you know play on soundtracks and sessions and jump on tours. Now I don't know Alan Dawson's story at all as a personally, but my perception of him and a lot of people I studied with was like, man, they're choosing to be educators. They're choosing to just be all about the craft. You know, that was really impressive. And I think Boston struck me as that. And then the times I got to go to New York and hang out, I got a similar sense. I did think that maybe New York, they wanted to get like the New York people I saw definitely also had the desire to get out there and be heard and be seen and embark out in the world. But it just seemed a lot more no bullshit. Um, I don't know. There's quite a lineage. And then, dude, think about like New York. You guys had like Cafe Wha. So even before there was like the folk scene, and then there was a rock scene. There was Woodstock. you know, you guys had, and then think about CBGB's and Max's Kansas City, and then that whole thing coming through like between starting with like Birdland, Blue Note, Minton's Playhouse with all the jazz people, Roseland prior to that with the big band, and then easing into maybe the 60s with all the stuff I talked about into the village, the whole folk thing, the whole rock thing, the whole Woodstock thing, and then going into the punk. Well, I guess what we call punk rock. I don't know.
Yeah.
Um, it's impressive. There's like some folklore there that's crazy. So New York is like a daunting place that I'll go there. I don't think I could handle living in Jersey or New York full time because just I don't know, man. I guess I'm from California, but I'll tell you what, like I have I have endless amounts of respect for what you guys have pulled off there. Fucking freezing too, man. Think of that.
Well, I can't
No
I
one can
can't
afford.
I can't group Jersey and New York together because like the place I live in like a little quiet beach town. And like
Mm-hmm.
when I go to New York, it like after a couple hours, I'm like, get me the F out of here. I can't.
Yeah,
It's a little
yeah.
much for me to do. I go there a few times a year just because I can, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm definitely not a city guy. Um, so I definitely I hear you on that one. I spent some, I actually saw some amazing shows at some of the venues you rattled off. One pops into my head. One of the cool shows I saw at CBGB's was the Ramones back in the day. That was just like
Yeah. Oh yeah.
legendary,
You got
legendary.
to you got to do that, and then you knew to go and do that. Like guys like me, I probably could have, but I just at the time I didn't know, and and now I just read about it in books,
Mm.
you know, and that's part of that's part of the musical folklore contributions that maybe North America has churned out, between that and think, I mean, was hip hop born in New York? It was it Cool
Yeah,
Herc?
I think like yeah, like Sugar Hill Gang and all that was
Yeah,
I think like the Bronx or Harlem or something, right?
yeah. I mean, so it's all stuff like, you know, music would not be what it is without all that, So it's
Yeah.
cool to think about, and I love the region. But back to Springsteen and all that stuff, like in Asbury Park, that's a whole other dimension, you know. That thankfully with these memoirs and with the storytelling, like, I mean, I always approach it like I did. Maybe we had a teacher in high school make us read the Odyssey,
Hmm.
and you would just look at a person's adventure on going out, the hero's adventure, and then finding their way back home. And it's an interesting allegory. And then when you get to read about these artists, because it's such a memoir is a bit of a odyssey. I get to read a different version of an odyssey, and it might be a working class dude from Birmingham who becomes Ozzy Osbourne, or it might be Springsteen. But like the whole thing of like somebody becoming an artist is this riddle, and there's not one path, and it's really tough code to crack. And there's so many cool ways to do it. Whether somebody just has a band for fun with their friends on the weekend and finds joy and authenticity in that route, or someone's like gets the lead role in a Broadway play and is like a freak of nature song and dance person. There are all those creative roads are relevant and beautiful. And I think it was really fun for me to hear people from where you're from figure their thing out and make their mark while kind of being steeped in what they were about. And
Yeah.
again, like I don't listen to enough of Van Zant's music and E Street Band and all that. I'm there's some stuff I'm getting into, but it sure makes me think about Asbury Park, you know,
Mm.
in
Something you
in a
brought,
really cool way.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Something you brought up kind of sparked a topic for me that I wanted to bring up at some point in the conversation. I was doing a little bit of reading, trying to like learn a little more about you online. I came across an interview, I guess, from some years ago where you were talking about your past life as an English teacher. And
Mm-hmm.
the reason I wanted to kind of parallel that is because I find so I'm a visual artist. That's my job, but I also am a
Yeah, I see
hobby.
the easel back there. You're a painter.
Oh yeah, I got lots of easels back here. I'm a painter. I love art. It's always been my thing. But I'm very much
Gotcha.
connected to like music also. I love learning about music. I love noodling around on it. Definitely not professionally, but I love it. And one of the things I have recently discovered a deep curiosity in that I never put the patience toward. I never focused on before was the stuff that melted your brain, like the music theory, like you touched upon. And I'm starting to finally force myself to learn the things that kind of hurt to learn and the things that never really made sense before. And I'm sort of seeing now the parallels of when I first learned the visual arts. There was obviously theories and color theory and all sorts of things that go along with art. And at some point in my past, and at some point in every visual artist's past, there gets to a point where you stop really you don't stop learning, but you stop kind of building the foundation. You start building and you start speaking. And when I saw that you were an English teacher, I want to ask you about this topic because I think someone that not only taught English and not only is a professional musician, but also the fact that you studied in Cuba. I assume you speak fluent Spanish, I assume, right?
Enough.
Enough.
Yeah,
So
enough
some
to get
so
by.
so somewhere there's like a parallel between like your brain of how you process language, music, the language of music, the language of English, the Spanish language. And for someone like myself that loves speaking in color and form and shape, and also
Mm-hmm.
is trying to learn a way to speak in music, I
Mm-hmm.
want to know how you think about that, and if there are parallels there as far as building the glossary of terms and theories and going from teaching a kid about verbs and adjectives to actually using it and actually expressing yourself in that particular language. I would love to hear you
Mm,
kind of riff on that.
yeah. Um, it's interesting you bring it up because I'm always torn with academia versus art, right? I was just talking to my mom. I had read this book about Dilla. You know Dilla, right?
I don't
And
think you know Dilla.
there's a really great book on Jay Dilla. Anyway,
Okay.
and it was written by an academic. I may be wrong, but the person who wrote it seemed to be really well read and academic and took an academic approach. And I was talking to mom. I'm like, man, you got to read this book about Dilla. It talked about how he stretched the time and it's almost like I was just marveling in a good way about how beat making and on an MPC and things like that have become a thing studied in higher education and academia. My mom said, well, you be careful. She goes, you can dissect a frog, but the frog is probably not going to live, you know, uh, kind of meaning like there is a danger of overanalysis
Right.
and taking the life out of something. Um, and but yet learning having teachers and having people who took the time out to just teach you is it's essential and it's a gift. I don't regret a second of the time I spent in the classroom. And like anything else in life, whether it's starting a family or joining a band or picking a career, teaching was not what I thought it would be. When I went at it, it was for me loving people like Bukowski, loving Vonnegut, loving, and then Fitzgerald, Diderot, like a lot of things that I liked. Being in high school was definitely like, and the most important lesson I learned teaching high school was service. Um, Being in the arts is notoriously like it can be very self-centered, for lack of a better term. Who's going to hear my song? How do I get this audience to respond? How do I develop my brand? It can be, I'm not saying for anyone else, but I've noticed for me, it could be like a self-centered thing. Teaching is about service, love and service. We all know that teachers don't get paid. We all know that it that that a, that an inner city English high school teacher who's done 25, 30 years of like incredible service work is not going to be on the cover of Time magazine or Rolling Stone. you know so I do find society's values is a little bit skewed. um, but I think I went into it maybe learning about the idea of service and about forgetting about my own plans and my own agenda. um, and yeah, in the process too, like I think it was cool to look at some of these novels and kind of and really look at like maybe what the author was trying to say, what it meant and what it meant to them, you know. And it might have been, and then in the process, maybe talking about these stories. A lot of times if it's high school and there's a curriculum that you're forcing on a bunch of kids, it is forced. You sit down with the department chair and they're like, this year, coinciding with U.S. history, we're going to do the Puritans, and then we're going to do the Dust Bowl, and then we're going to do the Great Depression. Then you do literature that corresponds, and so that was interesting and engaging. But yeah, you're having to teach maybe even books you don't like yourself. F the Red Badge of Courage. I don't like that book, but we had to teach it. So I was right there in the trenches with them. It gave me a second look about things I didn't like. Um, but what was cool in the process was those guys taught me about music too. Those kids taught me about life, but they taught me about music too. I had a lot of kids who were getting me into bands that I had no idea about. Mr. Topol or Adam, whatever. Have you checked out X, Y, or Z band? I'm like, who's that? You know, it changed, and because at that point I was in my early to mid 20s, but really to a high school student considered to be older. And I was already starting to leave the popular sphere of what people liked. And at the time, this is years ago, this is way before, you know, Brad from Sublime had passed away. We had a lot of kids were from the Long Beach area that were talking about Sublime, that they were talking about a lot of different art that I didn't know about at all, that they were getting me into. So we kind of all taught each other, honestly. Um, in terms of teaching, I probably could have stayed with it, but I think the challenge is that I wanted to just try some other stuff, you know. Um, there's always that thing, there's always the challenge of being an artist where you have creative urges of this reality, which is called rent, which is called paying the rent. You know, Tenacious D had a line, the legend of the rent was so hardcore. Um, I certainly thought that if I wasn't going to be a musician, um, I wanted to do something that didn't involve like stacking up as much of getting mine as possible. I wanted to do something altruistic that would make some kind of difference. My motives were, I think, decent. One of the, teaching didn't come easy, and I'm a guy that likes to sleep in, and being at homeroom at 7:35 was not the greatest joy, and and it just gave me a new profound respect for any career educator of any level. It's it was huge, and I think the love and service that teachers give is cannot be quantified. That being said, the summers off was really cool. Coinciding with teaching was me wanting to go to Havana, Cuba, and not knowing how to get there or pay for it. Teachers get summers off, and that's
Mm.
what I did when I was teaching. So I would go to Havana and Matanzas, Cuba, and study folkloric percussion. Some popular percussion, but folklore being there's a genre of music that kind of traces back to Africa. Um, a lot of heavy realities came from colonization, really sad history, but something that came through it was that through a lot of tragic colonization facts, some African traditions were brought specifically to Cuba, and I guess through a history that involved the Cuba basically isolating itself from a lot of the world. So a lot of the Yoruba African traditions, Congolese traditions that might have even changed a little bit in Africa. And I'm not an ethnomusicologist, so I could be dead wrong, but from what I was told, a lot of those traditions and linguistic tendencies got preserved in parts of Cuba that maybe even in Africa might have changed or developed. But anyway, the bottom line is, um, again, through really rough colonization, heavy stuff, you had some incredible music that grew there. Um, and for me as a drummer, it was really compelling. I think just like back in the literature world, where someone like Edgar Allan Poe seemed to me that he sat down and he learned the classics, and he could speak Latin and studied mythology and stuff. I thought as a drummer, even though I was, man, Black Flag or the Clash or Bob Marley or any number of bands that we all loved, I wanted to know where my instrument came from, where did syncopation came from, and where did the backbeat come from, and where did all these things come from. And I think maybe through checking out those guys there, I realized that I got the source of a lot of that stuff. Um, and speaking to academia, it was really fun leaving the confines of maybe a university or a music school. Music school, there's like, these are the number of notes that fit into a staff. These are these are the number of beats that fit into a bar. Maybe it's 4 beats in a bar or 2 beats in the bar. This is where the one is, you know. This is where the four is. It starts and ends here. You think about music like that. It comes from uh, maybe the church, maybe classical music. I don't know where it came from. But then you go to a place like Cuba, and first of all, they've got a lot more notes in that scale. It becomes microtonal when people are singing, and they're not necessarily thinking about any major or minor chords, or they're just singing. It's folklore. It's passed down from one person to another. And as far as rhythm goes, the time doesn't. They don't. I would ask these guys. They're teaching me these incredibly complicated rhythms on a conga drum or a bata drum or maybe hitting two sticks on a surface, or what they call claves, or a gourd with beads. And I'm like, where's the one? Because it sounds incredible, but you just don't know what the heck is going on. And they're like, well, what do you mean? It just starts here. And if I sat down with a notebook and I tried to look at 4/4 timing, I'd have to deduce through sort of the Western thought. Oh, that rhythm is starting on the an of three of the prior bar, and then crossing over the bar line, and then ending, and the of two. Like I'd have to just sort of translate it into the brain that I had, and that was kind of fun because it kind of made me be forced to discard these preconceived notions I had about music, and then to be around a bunch of people that learned by listening and feeling. And there was also an integration of dance, and of some spirituality involved in that music that I felt was absent from a lot of the music that I found from maybe Western culture. And so it was cool. And then what was really cool about it was, like academia, like teaching and stuff, it seemed to be mostly devoid of a lot of the monetization or fame components that I think pop music has. These guys, like you'd see a dude that was a radiologist, or a dock worker play an instrument beautifully or dance beautifully, and they just did it to do it. They didn't do it because, like, and why I've got this movie script and I'm going to try to sell it, and then I'm going to try to option it, or I want to get a record deal and I want to go on tour, and then I've got this idea about having t-shirts printed out there. Like, no, man, this is just what I do. I love this. I'm doing it just to do it. And I think all those things made me look at that other culture, made me like art again, and made me think that if I continued to be as a school teacher and I just did stuff for fun, I wouldn't be what's considered to be a struggling artist or not a success. It would make me a musician, you know? And I had to go to a place where people could be great, but just be people at the same time. It's hard to explain. In North
Okay.
America, though, I do think if there's nothing wrong with somebody succeeding and being recognizable in a widespread field, and whose contributions are loved and popular. But I think what I felt or what I perceived is that people who haven't fallen into that recognition, there might be a germ of this thing like, I didn't make it, or I'm not good enough. Or there might be the germ of somebody that did fall into it, maybe either feeling like an imposter, or maybe making the mistake of thinking, I'm a little bit better than the next guy. And none of it's true. I think art, is just reflecting where we're truly at that time in the most earnest and honest way possible. And I think going there and maybe teaching helped me kind of pull those ideas up in my brain.
What I'm hearing, Adam, is like I'm processing it in the way I think, and I hear a lot of similarities to the way I sort of process art and music, the way I kind of think about it. I remember when I was a kid, I fairly recently found an old essay that I wrote when I was like in grade school. My parents were cleaning out their attic, and I got this thing. It was describing like what I want to do when I grow up, and it was describing as a third grader how I want to do art so I can inspire people, I could help others, all these very noble things. And I feel like throughout my life, that's sort of like carried through. Where it sounds like you have a very deep connection with the lineage and history of your craft, which I really respect and admire. And I also relate to that quite a bit. But then I also, if I'm being honest, I also have fallen into pockets like where the realities of life sort of shift your adult brain into some of the downfalls that you described of like worrying about money and success, and am I
Mm-hmm.
getting enough likes? Do I have enough followers? All these
Mm-hmm.
stupid things.
Mm-hmm.
Always in the back of my head, though, always. It's like I feel like maybe there's like maybe these are like thoughts of grandeur that maybe we all have that are unhealthy, but it's like I want to feel like what I'm doing makes a difference, because I know when I go to a museum or I hear a beautiful piece of music, what those artists, musicians, creative people have done, even though they may or may not have meant it, it teaches me and it inspires me and it shows me what's possible. And it's almost as though I feel like they handed their torch over to me because I've spent a
Hmm.
lot of years in more, struggling times that a lot of artists can relate to. And during those times, like, I can't help but wonder, or I haven't helped but wonder, I don't know proper grammar there, but there's been times where I said, why was I given this thing? How come I couldn't have just gotten a finance job in New York City or something that pays better? Like, why
Hmm.
do I have this thing? What am I supposed? The only answer I could come up with is I was given this thing to see what I'm capable of, to see where I can take it. I feel like I was handed this torch from artists in the past and this long, noble lineage of people before me, and I feel like it's my duty to do the most with it that I can and show others different ways of doing things, and then handing that off. And I feel like that's sort of what I'm a very similar vibe from what I'm sort of hearing from you. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, and I really hope so. Uh, you know, think about, I don't know what bands you're into or whatever, but just think about how beautiful it is when you hear a song and it just makes you feel good, and it
Yeah.
gives you a whole different take on life, and it elevates your day. So it's a beautiful thing. I don't know where I'd be without all the great music and the painters. My gosh, man. I mean, whether it's Miro or whether it's Rauschenberg, whether it's Hockney, um, Pollock. I don't know. I'm not an artist like you are, but I'll look at something beautiful or hear something beautiful. I'll just be like, this is what it's all about, man. This is beautiful. But just as beautiful is anyone doing anything. I've been teaching a little bit, and I'll get somebody. Teaching's a silly word. Drums. We have a think tank where we just talk about music, and they'll play me some stuff and bands they like, and I'll listen, and then maybe I'll kind of I can't be dictatorial like maybe some of my teachers, but I can kind of say, well, that's cool. Have you thought about maybe trying this or slowing it down? But I get to see somebody else experiencing the joy in the music that they're making. And it might not be at a certain level as somebody whose dad would have been a drummer and they came up with a drum set in their living room, and then they did marching band and drum corps and youth orchestra, and now they're ripping and they can play anything. It might not be on a dexterity level that that person's on, but I see the joy in it, and I can and it got me to really figure out that for me art is in the joy can be had in the moment and within the scope of what that person can do, and if they're happy, you know and I think we get lost in maybe some sense of competition, or if I'm not at this level, I ain't shit. Sorry, I'm not anything bad. I always want to get back what I always want to get back to, like, it's cool for me to appreciate the masters, but it's also cool for me to appreciate anyone doing anything that's having a good time, you know? And I see that at my students, and it gets me pumped up all over again. All of a sudden, they'll get into a school of rock band and
Yeah.
they play their first Nirvana song and stuff. And they're psyched. They're like psyched, they're happy. That's a win. That's a win to me. And just as easily, if I see somebody who's a really good musician who has a really awesome profession and they don't have enough time to practice and they don't want to record because they're not as good as this, they're really being so tough on them. I just want to say, like, dude, you're great. Go do it. Just do it. It's just about doing it. And if we could just shut off that critical side of our brain, that comparative one, and just find the joy in it, that's the money right there. And we get in our own way there.
I think that applies for a lot of parts of life, doesn't it? I know for like a while I was sort of scared of the idea of being in like a long-term relationship. And I know a lot of people are very scared to start a business because what if? And you can apply that to everything. And it's so important because I think people do focus too much on like the short-term gratification and the
Mm-hmm.
short-term validation. Like they feel like I'm going to try this thing, but if I don't get enough, likes, or if I don't get enough compliments, or if I don't make any money, then it's just sort of wasting my time. And it's, well, it's
Mm-hmm.
such a horrible, toxic attitude. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a shame that that holds so many of us back from our dreams.
Yeah.
it's just it's sad. And as a dad of three kids, it's like I always want to focus on supporting whatever it is that they're doing, and not have
Hmm.
things attached, not have conditions attached to it. Like you can
Yes.
enjoy learning piano, or you can enjoy learning how to paint, and that's it. That's the end. That's it, it literally is just about having fun. And I try
Well,
to
so
teach.
there it is. You're talking about the craft.
Yeah.
There's a difference between maybe monetizing or um, working and then just the craft itself. They're very different things. I could tweak out for hours in a room with a drum or with an idea, and it's just fun. And every musician I know, whether they're multi-platinum people or whether they're beginners, the ones that they find, if they're doing it on any kind of level, they find the joy in the craft, and that's a universal gift, and that's a life-saving. That's something that's life-saving, that hopefully can be nurtured. I suffered with my art a lot because I always would try to I was always comparing myself, and
Mhm.
music school was rife with that kind of thing. you know Maybe comparing or letting somebody tell you you're not good enough. I've heard that. If I had $1 for every time someone said I wasn't good enough, or I wasn't going to make it, or I didn't have the discipline, or I didn't have the talent, I'd be rich. So many people, man, have including other musicians, not meaning to do it. It's
Mhm.
just life, man. And but if I could hang on to that joy and that passion, I'm good for that day.
Yeah.
you know
You know what I think about a lot, man, is like I think about these musicians and artists that I grew up being obsessed with, had posters on the wall, and it's like if some of these musicians that we all look up to, if they didn't get like a certain set of circumstances that got them well known, they
hmm
very likely would have been like the hobo that you walk by in the street, or someone that's or addicted, or sitting there with a needle in their arm. Like take someone like Kurt Cobain, or like Jim Morrison, or any of these legendary iconic musicians, and it's like if they didn't like make it, who knows? They probably would have just been like, looked at as from a lot of society as like, oh, that's just some bum or some scummy weird artist guy. And yet so many people like are comparing themselves to like these super famous artists, musicians, creators. And it's like you don't realize like it's such a fine line between like making it and being like looked at by a lot of society as a total loser. And it
hmm
takes kind of like a very interesting attitude. I see you kind of doing this. Do you disagree?
No, no, no. I totally agree.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Or, back to the Cobain, or maybe a lot of people that do experience success on that level,
Mm,
not speaking to anyone in particular, that had a rough time with it. Maybe they would have, had they not made it, maybe they'd still be around, and maybe they might have a gig
yeah.
teaching school, or doing some kind of normal thing and being okay. I think I'm not famous or anything, but I'm around people that are, and luckily I'm around people that are really grounded and cool, that can handle a situation like that, in a real spiritual way. But peripherally, I've seen it really throw people, and because I don't know how natural it is to a human soul. It's just an opinion. I'm not making, and I don't want to sound judgmental or whatever, because there are just plenty of fine examples of people that have massively succeeded and done interesting, cool things with it, and use that vehicle to help. But I don't necessarily think it's normal or healthy for everybody. And I think of, man, I went to Berkeley and saw just as many kids who were good enough to play in Mahavishnu Orchestra, who played in like, who went on to teach band class in Bakersfield, or some cool little town where they're getting an incredible artist that could play with anybody, but they're choosing to have a family and settle in Denver. You go to Denver, you will hear some great drummers, like great, sick drummers, who are really great mom and dads. Had they been handed a had they been handed a large sum of money and a lot of adoration, a lot of temptation, would they be better off and happier or not? I don't know. I mean, I don't know any of it, but I do know that, like, that the spirituality and the joy of art could be just as appreciated on a weekend level as on a whole lifestyle level. It doesn't. It's all relative. That's just my opinion.
I would actually argue to say that in a lot of cases, it's probably more enjoyable if you don't make it a profession. I know, speaking from my personal experience as well as other musicians and artists that I know, if you're not at the top level, then you've often, a lot of people I know or that I'm friendly with, they get sucked into this level where it's like you're just doing well enough to keep it going. Like it would be stupid to quit, but you're not well known or rich enough or whatever, or successful enough to let go of a lot of the tasks that you hate doing. Like, for using myself as an honest example, like I don't like doing social media. I don't like doing all these different things. Like I like the interactions, like I like the connections with people, but I don't like
Yeah,
all the bullshit. I don't like having to be the guy that's shipping my own stuff out, my own prints to people.
I'm in the same boat,
I'm
dude.
like
I'm in the
very
same boat.
super, I'm like super grateful. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm very grateful that I have the opportunity to do that. But I was painting and being creative a hell of a lot more before I made it a profession. And a lot of people will DM me or talk to me at art shows. How do you be a professional artist? Or how do I do this? And it's like, slow down, like enjoy your art and like don't rush it because you don't know what you're asking for. Like you don't know what the other side looks like.
Right, right. It's a grind. It is a grind, and and a noble one at that. But yeah, I like that. I mean, I think again, going back to the weekend musician, of which I see many, both in pop idiom and the Latin idiom. It's really cool to see an awesome dad who is a career electrician or whatever go and grab a drum and go off to the park and play good, really good rumba, really good Afro-Cuban music. And then they get in their minivan, they go home and they're with their family. Beautiful. And then I see the other thing of people that have made a career out of it. That's cool too. But each one has its ups and downs, you know. And it's really funny because both sides can easily tell you where the challenges are. You know, being a working artist, and that's the misconception I think that I had is I just thought, you know, artists, they sit around in a cafe and smoke French cigarettes and talk about poetry and hang out and they're creative and they pontificate. You know, fast forward, no, it ain't that. You're practicing. You've got deadlines. There's competition. There's stress. There's getting out there. There's interfacing with social media, which is very problematic for me because it gets in a whole other world. And you've got to market yourself just like a realtor has to market their listings, or somebody that sells ties has to get people to go in and buy their ties. It's a job, man. It is. And there are a few people, outliers, that are just born like so good they probably can't even explain how they do it themselves. You ask them like, how do you do that? Like, I don't know, I'm just me. And there are those types of people, but for most, they're like maybe you, and maybe hopefully I'm compared to you, awesome rad dad, where we have to kind of, we have to get out there and promote what we're doing and mix it up with people and market our thing. You know, I sell drum equipment as well. I have a company called Roots EQ, and we make cloth drum dampeners, and I have a Shopify site, and we're sending orders off and talking to clients, and I take gigs all over the place. And you have to do that uncomfortable discussion of like monetizing your art to some degree. This is what I charge to show up. This is what I would need monetarily to show up and do my art. That's a very weird notion, you know, when it's something kind of spiritual or maybe a little sacred. And so it can be really confusing. I get that. I totally get that.
I don't know how you approach it. For me, I try to like compartmentalize a lot. Like if I'm behind me at my easel, I try to like wear the hat of like I'm an artist. That's
Mm-hmm.
literally all I'm thinking about. And then when the painting's dry and it's ready to sell prints or whatever it might be or license it, then it's like a Mr. Business guy. But I try not to let the two personalities like influence talk to each other. So
Mm-hmm.
if I'm painting, I don't want the marketing guy rattling in my ear like, oh, I think your customers would like something. I'd like shut the fuck up. I don't want to hear you. You know, like I try to like
Yeah,
compartmentalize. You had
exactly.
you had mentioned several times now about different good, good drummers that are good family people. And it kind of prompts the question, which, like, what is a good drummer? And I ask that because I feel like, and I'd love to know your thoughts, not only as a drummer, but also as a former professional educator. I feel like my 2 cents is that a lot of the standards of the arts, in air quotes here, the arts have like
Hmm.
lowered. And I don't know if that's an evolvement of a good evolvement of us saying, well, anything is art, anything is music, anything is this, anything is that. It's not definable.
Hmm.
Or
Hmm.
is it more we're not giving enough education on the history and lineage of our crafts? Is it a combination of the two? Because now it's like as a visual artist, I like take umbrage at like saying anything is art and seeing like, a couple of years ago they had a banana that was like freaking duct taped on the wall and they sold it for $120,000. I'm like, are you
Right.
fucking kidding me? Right.
Yeah, that's got to be tough.
So I
I've
don't
seen
think
a few things
anything
like
is
that.
I don't think anything is art. I'm not in that camp. And I compare it to like music, like you said, a good drummer. Like I don't think like with anyone could take brushes and splatter it and you're an artist. But like not anyone could take drumsticks and you can't say you're a drummer. Like there's a certain set skills, but like I would imagine there's some kind of comparison. Is there a comparison there for what I'm describing, like with
Yeah.
standards?
Well, let's wonder because I don't know anything about art, but I would say I bet Jackson Pollock, knowing little about art, Jackson Pollock did what he did.
Mm.
I would bet money that if he had to do a portrait and accurately depict what an ear would look like and a nose and an eye, he'd probably nail it, right? I don't know about his life, but that's a guess. Certainly true with someone like Andy Warhol. I looked at his work. He kind of typifies the pop art guy that sort of took art into areas that may not necessarily like having to do with society and fame, whatever. But that's just my own judgment. It's not a bad thing. He was what he was. But I do know that I looked at some of Andy Warhol's work, and he could legitimately, he knew his craft. You know, he had something there. Um, and so I think the same is true with drumming. There are some people that are very well read. You know, I could pick up a book and read a snare drum etude with dynamics and time signatures and things like that and read it and stuff like that. And that play. And then there's some people that pick up the sticks and do something really primitive, but it feels good. So what does that mean about feel? I think some of the fundamentals in drumming that I like that I hear in other drummers is that they've got a sense, they make it feel. There's a feeling there. And there are certain laws of feeling in most genres that have to do with a consistency and like an emotion in which they interpret that time signature. Um, and I think teaching other drummers helped me get to that, um, because you'd hear a lot of people really impressed with like a really great drummer like Neil Peart, somebody a really extroverted rock drummer that played a lot of fills and did a lot of things that were really impressive and that stood out, and that's what grabbed people to want to be drummers, and that's great. I'm more of a minimalist though, and so I'm not at all at odds with that type of drumming. But I think with the people that were really expressive and virtuosic, I don't know the right word. I think even in all the notes that they were playing, each one of them fell in a really beautiful place and it connected and it landed and it kept the right kind of time. And but I can just as easily be moved by an old blues recording with a drummer that clearly did not know their rudiments, who couldn't read, and they weren't schooled, but they felt it. And the minute you heard it, you would just be like, "Oh, what is that? What is it?" Yeah, I felt it with a lot of the punk rock bands. I really responded to that. I responded to it with a lot of the well, world music is a big phrase, but you know, maybe some of the things I heard coming out of the West Indies or Africa or recordings, where people might not have been doing the most complex things, but it created a feel that had depth. You know, loved it. I mean, I loved hearing Meg White from the White Stripes. never understood why anyone would disparage what she was doing behind a drum kit. It was so cool, so basic. I don't think she went through a syncopation book or studied stick control or anything, but just loved what she did, and she connected with people. And I think that's what it is at the end of the day. And I think a child could do it. It's childlike and it's just beautiful, you know? And certain people can do it right away, and certain people have to take a lot of routes to get there. I don't know if that answers your question. With art too, I mean, shoot, man. Again, I'm a Dave Rauschenberg, you know? He does something really different. And is it a hustle? Are they playing a joke on you? I don't know, but it's cool. If I look at that tire and with the newspaper slathered on the paper and the antlers and stuff, I'm like, that looks cool. I don't know why, but I like it. I just like it. And maybe that's what art means to me. I just like it. I don't know. People get down on hip hop. Well, it's not really music, and they're sampling. They're sampling someone else's grooves. Well, yeah, but I like it, and it's funky. It's cool. Something about it's cool. It's there's something that you can't quantify in words, it's just like whatever that is, I want to go towards it. So maybe that's it.
Yeah, no, I feel you on that. You mentioned yourself being a minimalist. I was going to ask you about this because like you're drumming with when you play with like Jack or some of the other people that Culver City Dub Collective or other types of music you've been involved with. There's such drastically different styles, and you definitely your newest album Quando, that was the newest one I found on Spotify. It is so minimalist, and it I'm not a drummer, although I like I said I play around a guitar and bass, and I know a little bit about rhythm, although I'm terrible. But for me, it feels like, and I could be wrong, that playing more minimalistically seems harder because I feel like when there's more stuff happening, you could sort of like not necessarily hide your mistakes, but it's almost like when you're out on the dance floor dancing, you kind of just do your own thing. But when you have to do the exact same thing over and over and over, that feels harder. I wanted to ask you this question. Drumming is clearly more than timekeeping, obviously. I wanted to ask how do you sort of look at drumming as a form of like self-expression and storytelling when your style on your personal stuff at least is so minimalistic? What's going like how much of it is like keeping time in your head, counting? How much of it is like I'm telling a story, like building up the whole piece and as a narrative? Talk to me about that, Adam.
Hmm. Well, there's a couple of different things. So in the stuff that I do, certainly, like the last couple of records I've done, I've also added words on top of it and maybe some of my thoughts. And so I've had maybe the words help tell the story, but the feel and the time feel underneath, the tempo, the dynamics, um, the sounds, the decisions I make in terms of how the drums sound. Is the drum going to be open or ringy? Am I going to use a drum stick and give it some attack, or am I going to give it a mallet? Will I give it the sweep of a brush? Will that cymbal have like rivets in it and go and sizzle, or will it be staccato within a very simple beat? Whether it matters to somebody or not, or whether it's cool or not, or whatever, I will tweak out about each individual piece, about how it sounds, what frequencies are coming out, what will the drum ring, will it be really low and boomy, or will it be tight and boxy? All those things have to, I think inform the vibe of the song. um, and there's you could just have a bass drum, you could just have a 20 by 14 bass drum, and it can have so many different characters. If it has two heads on it, two tightened membranes with nothing inside, it can sound like a parade, right? With one note, boom. Or it can sound like a shaman. If you take the front head off and stuff a packing blanket into it, it can sound like a box, you know? And then so when you play that, and when you on a repeated pattern, it could sound again a parade march, or it could sound like something tight and funky. um, you could tune it low, and it could be deep and powerful. You could tune it high, and it's like a very wide high note. So I kind of tweaked out on each individual drum and what its character was. Different drum heads have different thicknesses, and some they all bring out different characters. I make pieces of cloth with galvanized steel wire perimeter. You sew the cloth across in a circle and nest it on top of the tom tom so that when you hit it, it sounds tight and quiet. You know, that's on my part at least a decision of how I'm going to accompany the other music that's stacked on top of it. Um, so a very simple beat can have layers and layers of thought underneath it that aren't not on everybody else's radar. Maybe not even necessarily the band's unless it jumps out, but they're certainly on my radar. When I saw the movie Get Back,
Mm-hmm.
that Beatles doc, I was looking
Unbelievable.
at Ringo, man.
Unbelievable movie.
Unbelievable what he
Holy
did.
shit. That was one of the coolest things I've ever seen.
So they're in the studio and there's Ringo back there. And my perception is, as many people as love Ringo, they might have, there are a few people that have maybe said that they might have made a few unfavorable comments about it, his minimalism. But if you look at what he was doing, they did not have headphones on. And there were acoustic guitar, very quiet instruments, and they're making music. And he's behind a baffle, but he sounded so nice. And he adjusted his sound to fit with what was going on with those guys. You know, towels over the drums. He maybe pulled some bottom heads off. He adjusted what he was doing to really gel inside of there. And so those were decisions he made, and it really worked. And I think it complemented the music.
Mhm.
And I'd like to think that maybe those are all things I think about when I play those beats, where I don't know, the listener may, I don't know about me. I don't even want to know what people think about me necessarily, but I'll certainly hear a song and I'll be like, why does that sound so cool? I was listening to Lou Reed the other day sing a song, and I'm like, I just like that song. I like how he's singing it. How does he do it? And it's two chords. The song was two chords, and then I listened to his phrasing, and I'm like, oh wow, his phrasing jumps and it skips, and he's accenting certain syllables that I would not have accent. And until I really analyzed it, I just would have been like, oh, that's a cool song, and it's only two chords. It's just cool. I just like it. But
Mhm.
then if I kind of nerded out a little bit, I got a lot closer in, and I realized that with some very basic elements, he made something interesting, and I like that. I like it, you know. But I also like listening to Miles Davis and
Yeah.
Tony Williams go to work, and I also like hearing Coltrane and Elvin Jones go to work, and I also like Mahavishnu and Billy Cobham go to work too. So they all have their place, you know. But everyone's soul is a little different.
I think Miles Davis and like John Coltrane, like if I go on Spotify and just say, "Hey, play station by Miles," based on Miles Davis. That's some of the music I listen to most when I'm painting because I catch my brush inadvertently kind of bouncing to like the bass or the drums, and I feel like the
Right.
music sort of flows into my paintings. And
Mm-hmm.
I love how in jazz it sort of takes you on a journey, like it's taking you all different places, especially like live jazz recordings where you hear them going somewhere. Like a dude will take the melody somewhere, and you're like, where on earth is he taking this? And somehow it comes back around. And I find that journey is almost like a musical movie when I'm painting, especially because it's like it's taking me all over. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so I totally feel you on that. You had mentioned Get Back, and I'm going to bring this up because we were just with the kids in Europe like several weeks ago, and
Cool.
we were in London for a bit, and we did every possible Beatles stop that we could. We did like Abbey Road, and we did whatchamacallit, the studio where they recorded the Let It Be album. And I stood out there, my wife and my kids, they thought it was cool, and they stopped, they took a picture, and I felt myself just standing there. I had to touch the doorknob, I had to sit on the steps.
Oh yeah,
And
I
it's
would have done the same thing.
yeah, I got freaking goosebumps. And I want to ask you this because like for me, I'm still like intermediate at best musician. So for me, like the magic is very, very much alive. And like that music, just that genre of music, carried me through so many parts of my life. And like seeing the Get Back movie, especially, just made it even more magical. And yet on the other side of it, as a grown ass man, I know that they're just people that had flaws and farted and put one leg in their pants at a time and all that stuff. And
Mhm.
I'm going to ask you this because I have a lot of musician friends that when I go to concerts with them, a good portion of them can't really enjoy it because they're sitting there picking apart the musician, they're picking
Mhm.
apart their performance or how they're doing what they're doing. And I guess I want to ask you, can you still connect with like the magic of the music?
Oh
And
yeah.
and
Oh yeah.
and on
Oh
the
yeah.
on the flip side of that, here's the other part of the question. Like, how about with the people? Like you're around so many well-known people. Is there a part in your brain where you compartmentalize, like, yeah, this is my buddy Jack or whoever, but also as a fan of some of the people, like I think I read in your bio you like work with David Gilmour. Like, is there a part of your brain where you're like, we're hanging out, we're getting lunch after the gig, but is there another part of you where like the magic of like this person has almost like a magical story in your head? You know what I'm saying? How
Oh
do
yeah.
those sides coexist for you?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. And then I just live in LA, so I'll just go to a grocery store and be like, whoa, look who just walked by.
Right.
Um, I guess to answer your question, I think I'm more of a fan, from a distance. I have found myself in some wild places, over the years, whether just because you live in LA and everybody that lives in LA. I was walking down Abbey Kinney Street and this actor named Pedro Pascal walked by.
Yeah.
And I really like his work.
Great work. Great actor.
And I don't talk to celebrities, but he walked by and I'm like, I'm sorry to bother you. I just want to tell you I really love your work. And he said, thank you. He walked by because it means a lot, maybe if somebody might say that to me, you
Mm.
know. And so I really do quite often, especially with people that I like, have those types of feelings of like gratitude and stuff. And on one hand, I think it's really dangerous to put people on a pedestal. I don't think they like it really. Um, it's hard to help sometimes, especially if it's someone that I love. Um, or it may be somebody that I have a backstory with. So it really depends. Mm, I think all that stuff gets tricky. I'm really honestly most comfortable if there's somebody that's really influenced me or that it's informed what I love, that I can just I can just enjoy what they do and stand back and be like, wow, dude, there's Matt Cameron. Whoa, that dude's bad. You know? Um, and I think what gets tricky for anybody probably is if you are interacting with somebody that is probably pretty well known to I never lose track of that. Like I think that it's a really tricky situation for people to be in, I would imagine. So I always try to be a little bit mindful of not maybe triggering any kind of awkwardness in a situation like that. I know a few people that act 100% normal, whether they're with the most famous actress in the world or whether they're with their best friend, you know, without any kind of agenda or weird energy. There's people like that out there. But I tend to take a note. I can read the room a little bit and maybe take it real easy around those people and just say as little as possible so I don't say something dumb. But which brings up the magic of reading of these new podcasts and these books. It's helped me tremendously. Like I've met a few people that I've really admired. And I did happen to maybe listen to them talk on a podcast or read their book or something like that. And every question I would be dying to have asked, and then some would be answered. And so by the time you meet the person, just be like, hey, what's up? I really like what maybe at an opportune time, say, I really appreciate what you do and not make them feel uncomfortable. And that's on a good day. A bad day, I can be awkward. So,
I'm definitely in that camp as well. To be totally honest, I've come across a fair amount. I've worked with or done stuff with a fair amount of well-known people, but the first 6 months or year of when that started happening in my career, I was definitely like a dorky fan that was stumbling over my words. And
Oh yeah, me too.
looking back in retrospect, I feel like such a dope. But but on the other side of it, I also think that it's cool that people, including myself, can have such an admiration and be in such awe of talent that it just so happens that that's the person that's carrying, they're the vessel of this talent that I admire. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
I don't want to ever let go of the magic, but but you also don't want to act like a bumbling idiot either. There's somewhere there's a balance there.
There is, and I think it's like with anybody and interacting with anyone, any human that you care about or that you want to make them feel comfortable. You want to not elicit feelings of discomfort or shame
Mm-hmm.
or weirdness, any kind of those emotions that well, it's back to reading a room or being empathetic or mindful, you know. I've had a few brushes with situations where maybe someone's making me feel uncomfortable and I felt more like I just didn't feel like they knew me for me or cared about me for me as much. Um, and I guess I always appreciate people who know how to make me feel comfortable and safe somehow or another. So, however, I can do that with anyone, whether they're someone of note or not. So there's that. There's being professional. I only meet famous people probably at certain work times, and there's like I maybe a level of professionalism where you don't want to act too, I'm being cool or I'm being I'm overcompensating one way or another, but you can just be gracious and cool and say something kind. And I agree, man. I don't really deal with fame people too much. I try not to, not for any other reason.
I'll tell you I'll share a story that's gonna make me feel goofy sharing it, but what the fuck, right? Years and years ago, well, let's start here. In my 20s, giantest Dave Matthews fan ever. I must have seen the band 30, 40, 50 times by that point. Huge
Wow.
fan. Then my art career sort of takes off. I start getting invited to festivals. I start doing international things, and my art career gets a pulse. And then all of a sudden, I go from being this like you know dorky unknown artist to all of a sudden now somehow people know my work. So I get a message. I get invited to Dave Matthews Show by Stefan, the bassist, and
Wow.
by that point,
That's been so fun.
by that point, my life it was. I'm not going to say normal because it wasn't normal, but I had been around enough other people to make it to act normal, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I afterwards I was like with my wife, and I had at the time my daughter was a newborn baby, and I was like, oh my god, this is unbelievable. I manifested this from the time I was like 20 or 19 or whatever, blah blah blah, and I couldn't get over the feeling of like how cool that was. And that those types of things happened a few more times, obviously in the beginning. And my wife said something which made me really feel differently about it. She said, "Yeah, this is like you may have you may feel awkward, you may feel uncomfortable, or you might feel excited or whatever, but realize that he invited you because he is a fan of your work, and
Yep.
like it goes both ways, and like
Mm-hmm.
realizing that someone that I admire can also admire me. That's a cool feeling, and that was a, a validation that wasn't like an. I guess it was ego related, but in my head, it was more about like, oh, like I feel like the work I put in earned me to be around the company of people that I also admire, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Which was kind of a
exactly.
cool feeling.
Exactly. And I think any of those awesome personalities in the art world or in the music world or in the acting world or in the literary world, if I I would have to think that if they clocked somebody around them that was well intentioned and was really delighted by what they were doing, that they would feel good about it. And I mean, I think anybody working in the arts that has people that love what they do must have a sense of gratitude about that, you
Mhm.
know.
Yeah.
And I'm sure those dudes did too. Dude, the time I met, I think Dave, this is the nicest guy. I was like, yo, man, can I take a picture with you? and he sits next to me and puts his cheek up to mine. I'm sitting there cheek to cheek with Dave Matt, and I was like, that guy's cool. I
Yeah,
like him. Made
totally,
me like him, you know.
totally.
And I probably hang out if there's anyone like that that I hang out with. They're all gentlemen or
Yeah.
menches or the woman version of that. Yeah,
I've
I think.
I found the same thing. I in 2007 is sort of when I was sort of exposed to some of your circle. I was invited to be a featured artist in Brazil, and the musicians on tour at the time with us was Donovan, G Love, ALO, and Matt Costa. And that was my first time meeting them all. And since then, that was in 2007. Since then, I've gotten to know them and I consider them friends. And it's cool how the transition goes from like, oh my God, you're someone I just saw on stage to like, oh, we're, you know, I wanted to ask you about how your practice looks, not only now, but I'm really curious how your approach towards your musical practice looked when you feel personally when your music grew the most, when you evolved the most. What did your like mindset and practice look like at that time?
Mm, mm, it's all different stuff. Um, I remember when I first started playing with Jack and Merlo. Uh, it was actually I kind of had some growing pains, and I would almost liken it to like, okay, look, that music sounds nothing like the Ramones,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe it had components of that because if you listen to do you like the Ramones at all?
I freaking love the Ramones, and thank God I saw them twice.
Oh yeah, you talked about okay, the Ramones.
I saw them at the
So
Pony and CBGBs, and they're one of my favorite punk bands.
okay, so they sound like one thing. It's this really amazing concept with deceptively dumb DUM, not DUMB lyrics, but it's funny, it's witty, and they're one unit, and it's a very powerful statement. Um, it's a whole organism, and with very integrated parts, and and I kind of think those guys had a really insightful ahead of most idea of what they wanted the whole thing to sound like, you know. And while I laud bands that stretch out and do self expressions, they know how to do that, you know, and that's what and fans love it and good. But in other projects, there's a concept, and people have to fit into that concept. And so at first it was really hard because I had to strip away a lot of the things that I would have maybe wanted to try or do in the framework of a song. And maybe the 11 fills that I knew got stripped down to two of them, you know, and maybe the time should be a little faster or slower than what I felt, you know. But it was such a good learning experience working with really good songwriters that maybe heard parts that I didn't hear, and that they weren't even necessarily drummers. Um, that was a huge eye opener to me because all of a sudden, and art is when you have to make. I don't. I'm not envious of a painter who's just man versus canvas. You have to make all these decisions yourself. It's not like you're with three other painters going, well, should we paint an eyeball there or should I smudge it with my thumb and make it look like a swoosh? You know, you have to make those decisions yourself. But
Yeah.
I think working for a very talented artist and having other people in a group, people talk about things and people try things. And so you learn a lot, maybe stripping back what you think you knew and building something from scratch that fits a certain uh, concept, you know? And I think those guys taught me huge amounts about music, you know? And some of the lessons came easy and some of them came hard, you know? Uh, I, I think practicing with a pad is really valuable. I think reading is really valuable. I think listening to some of the greats and slowing it way down and figuring what they did, that's really powerful. Sometimes I think taking a step away from all of it and having some quiet time is really great for practice. And then coming back and getting a fresh idea about a song or just getting reinvigorated. That's valuable too. The only thing that sucks is if I'm beating up on myself or pushing myself to a point where like I have to sound like this, I
Hmm.
have to sound exactly like this, and then all of a sudden I literally am hurting myself. I'm limping because I'm overexerting my right foot, or I get wrist joint pains and things like that because I'm just trying to my ego is driving my practice, and at that point I'm not being good to myself, and I'm trying. So I guess it's all different stuff, but it ain't beating up on myself. That's what I know. What that it isn't that, and I know that people that aren't drummers can give me better growth tips sometimes than drummers. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it totally makes sense. I have a couple more questions. Are you cool with on time?
I got 5 more minutes before I get to
All right.
a Afro-Cuban drumming thing.
All right. I'll throw two things at you. You can pick which one to answer. How about that?
Okay.
I was talking to Matt Grundy and I was like, hey, I'm talking to Adam soon. You
Wendy.
got anything that I should bring up? And he had mentioned, well, ask Adam his take on the Rock Tumbler tour. That's choice one for your question you could answer. The other thing you brought up ego, and you seem incredibly humble. And I was also going to ask you how if you have any mindfulness practices because you're going from being in these arenas or people kissing your ass and like first rate treatment everywhere you go to like then you said you have your own Shopify store and you're packaging your own stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
there's two questions for you. Whatever one strikes you, you
Well,
can.
they both relate. Okay, so
Okay,
the rock. I'll go quick. Grundy is like one of the best musicians I've ever met. He's
great.
ridiculous, and he's a and gee, he's a mensch. Um, they let me. I'll tell you the story of the Rock Tumbler. The Rock Tumbler was a Sprinter van that had been used before us, I think, by a punk rock band. And let's just say the mattresses in the bunks were not clean. Let's just say that. Um, and let's just say they were touring Europe. They let me jump in this little van. This is when I just decided like if I'm going to be a singer songwriter, I'm going to go with an acoustic guitar and no effects and plug it into a PA and just sing and play, and not and be let's be real. That's what I'm doing this time, and that's what I did, and they let me do it. It was so nice of them. They let me get on the Rock Tumbler. Let me say that they kicked ass every night and that they had no days off except for one in Berlin where it was freezing. And that Grundy and I shared the same room because we both snored. But I do resent the fact that I got labeled a snorer because I am not, in fact, a snorer. That was the only thing they did wrong. Um, yeah, our dog snores louder than me. I don't snore. That was the only injustice on the tour. The Rock Tumbler, you had to load things through the front door like giant amps and stuff and get through Europe in the winter with no days off. And those guys really work and they perform great. And they thought they gave me the very worst bunk because the curtain was torn up when really no one had vomited in my bunk. And so I had the non-vomit bunk, and I think they all had the nice looking bunks, but they had like yucky bunks. So that was the Rock Tumbler, and it was one of the funnest tours I've ever been in. And for the camaraderie, for the adventure, for getting to be included, and that was epic. And then as far as like attitude goes about music, um, dude, if anyone is getting $1 to play to make something cool, if 3 people want to look at a drawing I make or hear a song or whatever, that's cool, man. That's a gift. It's a true gift, you know. I really think that. Um, and practice to get that way, I think for me is like having lived and having had good times with having really rough times too. What the rough times taught me was a sense of spirituality and faith, and what the rough times taught me was to really focus in on what was good and beautiful. What can I be grateful for? And look at that as stuff that's a gift, you know. And I have to think of things like that, you know. Yeah, if you're getting to do something that you love in this life, you're lucky, you know, and that's a good thing. So that's it.
Awesome. It's a great attitude to have. I think if you could look for gratitude, you'll find it. And I think that's part of being an artist in general. If you make a practice of looking for beauty, you will find it, you know, and likewise, if you look for shit, you'll find that too. And
Oh,
it's
just open up the news. Go
yeah,
to dailymail.com. All you can see is outrage, outrage,
yeah,
this, that. And then there's a girl in a hot bikini. More outrage, more gossip, more scandal. It's harder look to find good things, you know?
absolutely. Adam, thanks so much for taking the time. I appreciate
Yeah,
you
hey.
extending this as long as you did. I'm really glad we got to chat. I've heard so many good things about you from mutual friends, and I really appreciate it, man. Thank you.
Blessings.
All
Have
right.
a great afternoon in Asbury Park. Best
Enjoy
to
the
you.
rest of your day, Adam. Thanks, man.